I have the great pleasure of having Mallorie Vaudoise as my first guest on the channel. And Mallorie is an Olorisha, she's a Quimbandera. She's an expert in Southern Italian folk traditions, saints, and magic. She's also deeply knowledgeable about African diasporic and Italian ancestral veneration practices, and the author of Honoring Your Ancestors, A Guide to Ancestral Veneration, published by Llewellyn Publications and is due for release in September. So big welcome, Mallorie. It's super exciting to have you on the channel.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Balthazar. I'm very excited to be speaking to you today.
I want to first start by saying big congratulations with the book. You know, this book is the book that I wanted when I was starting out on my path with ancestral work. And what you've managed with this book is to somehow ground this book in a vast kind of interconnection of tradition, and managing to keep it ecumenical and accessible for someone who's not coming from any one tradition per se, without it turning into New Age gruel. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what brought you to working with the ancestral powers. What was your journey connecting with the ancestral forces and the dead?
Sure, and thank you for your kind words. That was really exactly what I was trying to do with the book, was to bring, you know, the benefit that I've had from being able to learn from traditional sources to people who don't have that direct connection and who are going through more of a process of self-inquiry. So it's great to hear that that's how it reads to other people. In terms of my own journey, I think I've always been a somewhat sensitive soul. And as a child, I had a very strong awareness of the presence of my ancestors, particularly my great-grandparents, my mother's father's parents, who were very present and very strong, protective, nurturing spirits in my life. And I remember very distinctly once as a small child, maybe like 4 or 5 years old, I was out on the playground, and I don't know what had happened that day at school, but apparently they hadn't been very pleased with it, because all of a sudden I became like overwhelmed by these feelings that didn't map to anything that I knew about in my small, contained 5-year-old consciousness, but which had to do with feelings of loss of the old country, anger at the way that their great-grandchild, so I, was being raised, and this sense of like regret that came along with that, and what would have happened if we had stayed. And I had no context for this. I was 5 years old. I was a kid. I didn't know what was going on. I just knew that all of a sudden I was very angry about something that I didn't really know what it was, or understand it, or have any way to map it onto the things that I was normally angry at when you're 5 years old. You know, you don't get ice cream after dinner and all of a sudden it's the end of the world. And so that was really the one early example of what I would describe as my encounters with mediumship. And the kind of clue there that you may have noticed in the story, and the clue that I kind of held on to as I was developing as a medium, even outside of any context for that, was being able to differentiate between my own emotional baseline and my understanding of how that baseline deviates throughout the day, and then the things that seem to come out of nowhere and are completely unlike any feeling that I've ever felt before. So I had that kind of background growing up, and then it was only as an adult, over the past, I guess, 5 to 10 years, that I became more and more involved in traditional religions, as you mentioned in the intro. And that took all of these strange feelings and experiences and phenomena that I'd gone through throughout my entire life, and gave them a context, and gave me connections with people who had that same context and who had had similar experiences so that I could start to map the strange things I had experienced onto a language that involved words like ancestral consciousness and mediumship and all of those lovely things.
Fascinating. And maybe you could give us some context for the traditions. And we mentioned you being an Orisha, and your connection to Quimbanda, and then the Italian current there. So maybe you could create some context for us and describe some of that work that you've done.
Yeah, so in terms of my relationship with my own ancestral Italian traditions, after I moved to New York, I started to become more and more interested in Italian folk religion and its survival in the United States. I am Italian American, but my family sort of bypassed Italian American communities, which are the strongholds of the traditions, and went straight to living on a farm in the middle of kind of nowhere, and being more integrated into the United States culture as a result. They didn't have that same community structure, which would have helped them to keep the traditions more intact. But here in New York, there's so much that has still survived in the forms of the feast days that are dedicated to the saints. And as well as that, there is also a kind of, I would say, maybe younger movement towards returning to Italy and picking up some of the traditions that we have lost. So in Italy, particularly southern Italy and Sicily, the music is an incredibly important part of the spiritual practice. It's a part of the devotion to the Madonna. It's a part of rituals that are associated with the fertility of the land, as well as trance and exorcism. And those traditions were the ones that suffered the most in the United States, in part because they're usually tied to particular pilgrimage sites, which of course, we don't really have here, as well as because of the fact that they are so erotic, so sensual, and not necessarily the type of thing that the Catholic Church in the United States was willing to allow to continue.
Ah.
So it was definitely the type of thing that was targeted explicitly for being shut down.
And as I understand it, you're an apprentice to the master folk magician Alessandra Belloni, correct? And
Music and magician as well. One of the things that makes Alessandra so fascinating as a teacher is the fact that she's done field work throughout southern Italy and Sicily. I think she's been doing this work for about 32 years now, maybe. And so she has both gone very deep into the lineages that she has worked in, that she's been taught within, which are in Italy, because it's so mountainous, there's a lot of parochialism. You have one town that does things a very specific way, and it's going to be very different and very, very well defined when you compare it to even the town next door. But if the town next door is on another mountain and there's like a valley between them, it's very hard to travel even a short distance. And so she's really traveled throughout the region and been able to go very deep, but also very broad, and to bring more of the context, as well as the context that she has as an independent scholar, doing the historical research, the ethnographic research, and looking at how these traditions that are, some of them alive today, some of them she learned maybe 30 years ago and are not as active, how they relate to the ancient practices of the cults of Dionysus, Cybele, the Eleusinian mysteries, and understanding what the relationship is between the type of spiritual exorcism that maybe you would have seen in Puglia in the 80s, or even going back further into like the 1950s, and the cult of Dionysus, for example.
wow, fascinating.
And then for me, it's particularly fascinating to see this and to be able to compare it to what I've seen in African diasporic ritual, and the parallels that exist there, which, you know, are not necessarily parallels as in you can find Django in Italy. Well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. I don't really know. I haven't seen him there yet, but certainly in terms of the technology that is used, the way that music, dance, drumming, color, and all of the sensorium really is used in order to facilitate altered states of consciousness that lead to spirit contact. It's shocking, actually.
And of course, working with the dead within that context would be something that's also informed your work deeply, I imagine, as Italian ancestral veneration and so forth.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning before, the way that the traditions are preserved in Italy is inextricable from the shape of the land, both in terms of where the different pilgrimage sites are, you know, these places of power that people will return to year after year in order to perform certain rituals, as well as the ways that the structure of the land, the kind of mountainous terroir, has made it difficult for there to be sharing even in between people who technically don't live that far apart. And so because of this, we saw this tradition, which was extraordinarily popular throughout. I'm not a historian, but my understanding is probably between, like, you know, the 15th century and even until maybe the 20th century. Extraordinarily popular, perhaps more popular even than you know, ecclesiastical Catholicism, the official word on what the Catholic Church is supposed to be.
Wow.
Which then goes into decline starting in the beginning of the 20th century. And as it goes into decline, it is preserved in these pockets that aren't talking to one another. And so different parts of the traditional knowledge get preserved in different ways. And that's why we find in, for example, Naples in Campania, which, if you think of the lovely boot of the mother country, it's like the shin of the boot, has all of this lore, which is very well developed around the cult of the skulls at Fontenelle Cemetery and the mediumship which occurs between the old women who go there in order to essentially identify a spirit familiar and then work with that spirit in order to produce certain gains that they need for themselves and their families. You know, standard stuff, health, access to food and work and love and all of those things. And then you also see on the other side of the country, on the heel of the boot, in Puglia, more technology around drumming that has been preserved. And that's where we find dances such as the pizzica, which were up until even really the 1950s used in a spiritual therapeutic context, where traditionally they were understood as dances that were used to drive out spirits of the dead who had been afflicting some person. So it is very much a musical exorcism in that way. But even though the shape of those two cults, as they have been practiced, even until fairly recently, are quite different. You know, there's, as far as I know, not a lot of drumming that happens in Fontenelle Cemetery. And over in Puglia, people don't necessarily publicly identify the spirits that afflict their friends and family as spirits of the dead, although I do think that they might be a little bit more open about that in private. Nevertheless, these two cults have descended from the same sort of soup of beliefs, the same worldview, the same bodies of practices, which were once one thing. And really, when, for me, in my experience, when you bring them back together, it makes a lot of sense how they're actually one thing. And that means that your practice is no longer just the reenactment of a ritual that someone somewhere did one time, so much as this whole confluence of knowledge, traditional knowledge and traditional practices that come together.
And I find it interesting because this parochialism is very much evidenced in the food in Italy. I mean, if you travel in Sardinia, you'll have a dish that gets prepared in a certain street,
Yeah.
and three streets up, it's prepared in another way, and that's the only way it's ever been done there.
Hmm.
And the twain shall never meet. So,
Exactly.
and I think the culture around the food reflects very much the same kind of thing. And perhaps the geography, the mountainous terrains and so on, various other geographic markers and separations play a role in that. But would you say that there is some sort of, some tendency, cultural tendency with Italians to preserve kind of very specific focused traditions in that way?
I think so. I think so. And I find it both when I travel to Italy, both like charming and frustrating. Um, Charming in the sense that like I love to see the way that this type of mindset preserves things so well, and the amount of detail that goes into the preparation of the foods, and the way in which every recipe is almost a ritual itself, a story, a reenactment of something, the stomping on the grapes, or the beating of the dough in order to make pasta. But on the other hand, it can lead to this kind of attitude of, well, we do it this way over here, they do it that way over there, and they're wrong. And
Well, we
I
see this. We see this in the magical community too.
all the time. It's not a uniquely Italian thing, but when you see it in Italy, it's very apparent, and the
Oh, yeah.
relationship that that has with the traditions, whether they're musical traditions or culinary traditions or cultural mores, is very evident.
Yeah, a certain kind of chauvinism about whatever it is your thing is, music or food
Yes.
or folk beliefs and so on. So to just change gears for a moment and get back to a more general discussion around ancestors and the dead, one of the things that I really loved about your book, and uh, yeah, is going to be so useful for helping with my own students, is your typology around types of ancestors, and the way that you go about your exposition around that. You identify blood ancestors, lineage ancestors, affinity ancestors, and then guides, ghosts, and then a couple of others. And I really enjoyed, I just enjoyed that treatment. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the differences between these types, because I find this is a really important topic with people when they're dealing with the ancestors. There's the instinct to think that these are all blood relatives that are close blood relatives. It's, I think, a very interesting and useful uh, tool set you've given this typology. So maybe you could talk a bit more about these differences.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's two things that I definitely want to touch on here. One is who qualifies as an ancestor, and the other is how do ancestors become manifest in our lives, which, as you touch on, is usually more as a legion rather than discrete individuals. And so, in terms of who do we get to call an ancestor, my personal definition is quite simple. Ancestors are the dead who have given us gifts. And these are very important gifts, gifts that we have internalized, gifts that are kind of the vehicle through which our spirit expresses itself in the world. And so I have a very, I must always be very respectful of my blood ancestors, the ones who created my body with their body, because without them, I would not be here. I would not have this body. I would not be able to have this incarnate experience. And I rely on them for the continued health of this body, for in order to continue traveling through this world. And one day I'm going to rely on them for making the transition smoother when this body no longer is. And so I think it's tremendously important not to forget about the blood ancestors, but also not to limit ourselves to them. because those are very important mysteries, but they're very particular mysteries, and they don't necessarily cover everything that we experience or every gift that we have received from the dead. In taking my own life as an example, again, I speak English as my mother tongue. I don't have any ancestors who spoke English as their mother tongue. That's starting to change now as my grandparents' generation passes away, but none of them really contributed to the development, the evolution of the language, which is the language that I use primarily to express myself. It's the language that I think in, it's the language that most of my dreams are in. And so that means that I need to, if I'm going to really internalize this gift of being able to communicate, and to form thoughts into certain shapes, I need to also honor all of the ancestors who contributed to the development of the English language, just by speaking it every day, or by passing on the grammar, or by writing the poetry and the prose, which has built up the vocabulary and the set of idioms that we have access to every day. So right off the bat, like, we start to notice that it's not just about blood. It's not just about our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents, but it's also about everybody who trained in whatever occupation you have. If you're, a chef, you are connected to that lineage of chefs that, developed certain sacred knowledge and then passed it on to you. If you love to sew, that is a connection to every ancestor who learned how to harvest natural materials and spin them into thread and weave them into fabric, and then to sew that fabric together into clothing. If you are LGBT, you have access to every person who identified as queer throughout history, and to all of the knowledge that they have of those particular mysteries, of what it means to be going against the grain in society sometimes, of what it means to love someone of the same gender. And so I find, like, if there is one gift that I want people to get out of my book, it's the expansion of the definition of what constitutes an ancestor, and the permission, the license to incorporate all of your gifts into your spiritual practice and your experience as an incarnate spirit, and all of your ancestors into your ancestral practice. All of your ancestors, they get a place on your altar, they get a place in your prayers, and they get to be there for you, guiding you and blessing you along the way.
Fascinating. So that brings me to my next point, and this is something I find really fascinating, because, and this is really fitting more into the spiritualist, the spiritualist tradition and the different offshoots from that tradition. So whether it's Spiritismo in its various forms, the Afro-Cuban form, or many of the other forms that you see throughout the New World, or within the Anglo spiritualist tradition, is the notion of the spiritual guide. And the guide, of course, is not a blood ancestor. This is an advanced soul of another kind. And the way that I like to explain this to people is that they're part of your spiritual genetics rather than your biological genetics. And that the makeup of this composition of guides in your spiritual framework therefore constitutes a kind of structuring of your spiritual life. So could you talk a bit more about that?
I should give the caveat that I have not trained in Spiritism specifically, and so I can't comment on what it's like to be, a trained member within that church, within that tradition. But I will say a little bit about my experience with my own guides, and what that looks like, which is I really believe that we're drawn to certain people at certain points in our lives because they're reflecting something back to us. And I think we see this both with our spiritual court and how that evolves over the course of our lives, as well as with our friends and lovers. And the ways that, you know, sometimes there's just something that we're going through and someone else is going through it too, or has gone through it. And it's almost as though, you know, God, the universe, the Black Madonna, however you want to call it, is bringing us together so that we can be reminded that we're not alone, and we can see something of our own spiritual journey reflected in the other. I'm actually going through this right now with a friend, a regular friend who's incarnate. she's a person, not a spirit. Well, a spirit who's a person, and we have the most bizarre uh, parallels that are happening in our lives right now, in terms of our love life and our work life, and we have the same job at the same company, and our names sound very similar. They're almost like the same thing, and we have kind of formed this special relationship where we're both propelling each other in the right direction. And able to, you know, when she's feeling down, she texts me and I support her. When I'm feeling down, I text her and she supports me. And I find that guides are very similar to this type of a relationship where some of them may follow us throughout our lives. Others may be here in our lives for a much shorter period of time. Maybe some of them show up just at one seance or misa. Maybe some of them show up just for one season, 1 year, 5 years, whatever it may be. But they are reflecting something back at us of what we're going through and what we're developing within ourselves at that point. I don't see my spiritual practice, even though I do tend to emphasize, you know, guidance and blessing when I'm describing it to people. For me, it's not a gumball machine. I'm not just like putting offerings in it and hoping that like more money and more sex and you know, a better apartment comes out of it. It's more about the transformative process that I'm going through. And I know that I'm on the right track when the things that my spirit wants to experience in the incarnate world begin to manifest. But that internal process needs to happen. And that's what I look to my guides for.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there is a flip side to that, of course, in the sense, especially when your basis of ancestral veneration is strong, that they can actually kind of knock you back into line. Also, it's not just a case of making sure that you're doing well. In my experience, if you step out of line, they can kind of give you a bit of a wake-up call too. And there is
Yeah.
a there is a certain yeah, there's, I won't say it's a downside, but there is definitely the kind of relationship that you would have with a parent or a grandparent, that if you stepped out of line, that grandparent would be willing to just be honest with you about that and maybe give you a good kick in the pants if you needed it.
If you step out of line or if you're ignoring your lessons.
I mean, yes.
That's the big thing too. If there's something that you've been ignoring, it comes back and it's louder next time. And, you know, eventually it gets to the point where like your life can be destabilized if that's what you need to kind of like wake you up and force you to look at you know, where you may have gone astray. But yes, there is this kind of like as they get stronger, they do become a little bit more they can be more heavy-handed. And certainly sometimes I'm jealous of people who have not done this type of work, and I see them getting away with stuff that like I know I would never be able to get away with. It would be
Yeah,
instant karma, you know.
totally. This reminds me of an anecdote that you give in the book where you talk about, this was very moving, you talk about you'd been in an abusive relationship in your 20s with a character that was really no good for you, and you got a nudge like that.
Yeah.
Could you tell us that story, or maybe, or something like that?
Yeah. So when I was a bit younger, I became involved with an older man who I did not realize at the time was a very serious alcoholic. I knew that he was a big drinker, but I didn't know exactly how that was impacting him and our relationship. And I was very supportive of him. I was very financially supportive of him, emotionally supportive of him. And I think in part because everybody gets this to a certain extent, but women in particular were taught to be very nurturing, and taught to kind of distance ourselves from our anger when we feel it. And consequently, I think a lot of women, particularly in that journey between like 20 and 30, a lot of the lessons are about developing better boundaries, and rather than trying to become more accommodating, more supportive, more nurturing, actually figuring out when a boundary has been crossed and how to defend it better. And so in this case, I had been hanging out with this individual for a while, but I'd never actually brought him back to my apartment before. And the first time that I brought him into my apartment, we were sitting on the couch together and we were talking, and it was the same as any conversation that we had ever had before. And I was being my same, accommodating, supportive self. And all of a sudden, I heard a voice say, "Get out." And I just repeated it to him. And I had never been so direct with a man before in my life, but I just told him, "Get out of my apartment, get out of my life." And I turned on a dime in this conversation, which was really scary to me because I knew that he thought I was the crazy one. I felt like I was the crazy one. But something in that moment just really overwhelmed me, the same way that I talked about being overwhelmed as a child by this feeling that didn't map to my own emotional body, my own understanding of my like baseline and where it goes throughout the day. And what I realized after he left was my couch in my living room in this apartment was directly across from my ancestor altar. And this was the first time that he and I had interacted in front of that altar. And so I don't know if they had better insight into what was happening because they were seeing it directly, or if they just had more access to me through some kind of mediumship because of the fact that we were so close. Or heck, maybe it was even just, psychologically, I could not bear to let someone treat me this way in front of all these pictures of my, grandparents and great grandparents. But it gave me the push that I needed to say something that had to be said, even though I didn't know how to say it, even though I didn't know what is the quote unquote correct way to do this. And to be willing to like take that risk and, set a boundary, even though I didn't know the right way to do that, was huge.
And I like what you say about the awareness that there were multiple factors, that there was a nudge, there was a spiritual component, but there were the images, and there was a constellation of things that kind of came together with that impulse. And I think people don't realize this about spirit contact, that people tend to think of it as a very binary thing, but spirit contact tends to happen within a constellation of events. And mediumship too, I find, is very similar. If you're doing a sitting with a client, on the way to the sitting, you might see a van drive past with an image of Krishna on it, and then in the reading, maybe an ancestor of Asian descent comes forward. But it all arises in this constellation of things that are both external and internal spiritual experiences.
Absolutely. And there's no way for us to separate out any of these threads. We experience everything all at once. Right now I am experiencing this conversation while I'm experiencing this green tea and there's my cat is making funny noises in the background, and none of these things are actually happening in isolation. It's like it's all kind of rolled into one and rolled into a single gestalt experience that I'm having right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deeply animist. If looked at it a certain way, it's deeply animist because it's seeing the world, what would otherwise be considered a materialist kind of experience as really being, just another communication channel for the numinous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we almost do a disservice to our children when we teach them the scientific method before we teach them about the numinous and about experience and phenomena and being able to understand something as all of the variables all at once. There's no way to have spirit contact in lab conditions, not because it doesn't exist, but because the idea of isolating a single variable in order to measure the impact it has on a single variable does violence to the animist experience.
Oh, certainly. I mean, and it presupposes something outside our subjective experience that
Mm-hmm.
could be measured. And I mean, that's a great topic for discussion in itself. But what is a simple way in which our viewers can begin working with their ancestors, and what are some of the benefits they can expect?
So one of my goals when I think about this work that I'm doing, both in terms of writing the book, but also in terms of being a bit of an evangelical animist in my online presence and helping put people in touch with the tools that they need to start their own practice. I try to keep it very simple. And so the recommendation that I make, at least today, is a candle and a glass of water. And I like to describe this as it's almost like a spiritual probiotic. If you are living in an environment where maybe the spiritual ecosystem has suffered some damage and there isn't that kind of healthy biome, this will help to facilitate that. And in particular in the United States, I notice as I'm going around to different people's homes that this is a more common of an issue than actual malicious spirits moving in and wreaking havoc, is just like the lack of the healthy ecosystem. And so flame and water, those are the two primordial elements, fire and water, through which everything else emerges. And you also have the interaction between the two of them, where the light from the candle, when it is directed through the water, the crystalline structure, generates a rainbow. So it's like the light of God kind of being refracted into all of these different, manifestations of spirit, which is symbolism that I really like. So that, I think, is like the best starting point. Don't overthink it. Don't worry about like, oh, do I have to put it in the east or in the west, or is it okay if it's in my bedroom? In New York, for example, a lot of us live with roommates, and your only option is to keep your spiritual practice in the bedroom. Don't let the questions and the concerns and the like, oh, what if this or if that, the hypotheticals paralyze you. The point of this exercise is simply to start building up a spiritual ecosystem, and then as that biome is reconstituted, that's when you may get some guidance on, hey, actually, I should move this to another room. Or, oh, I should add a picture of my grandfather. Or, oh, I should add a rosary to it. And that's also around the same time, by the way, that you should start to see some changes happening in terms of more increased intuition usually is a big one. Sometimes increased emotionality and increased emotional sensitivity can happen as well. But really, I think the guidance is the thing that you're going to be looking for, because as you follow that guidance, that's also when you'll start to see the physical manifestations of the new opportunities, the new job, the raise, or whatever it is that you're looking for.
I love that. And I love the simplicity of working with a glass of water and a candle. And of course, this can be a challenge to a lot of people, to just maintain a glass of water and a candle with any degree of consistency, to
Mm-hmm.
refresh that water weekly, to treat it with respect and work with it in a consistent way. Um, some people find that difficult to develop that habit. And that's really, I love the simplicity of that. And certainly before you turn it into an elaborate altar necessarily, that should be your first port of call. I wholeheartedly agree. And extremely powerful, extremely powerful. And for our magician viewers, one of the things about that, of course, the use of water, working with the dead, is very much from the side of the spiritist side, the spiritismo and Afro-Cuban spiritualism. And what I find intriguing about that is um, scrying methods that you find in Solomonic sources that use glass containers with water in them for conjuring spirits into the container also. And I've often speculated that there may have been some cross-pollination there with the grimoires into the spiritualist melting pot. That is certainly a thing, and it's something that really came to my attention when one of my godparents actually would sit with a glass, blow cigar smoke on the glass, and say, "Let's scry this glass," and proceeded to scry the glass like it was a crystal ball. And it strikes me as a good substitute for a crystal ball.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that would be a difficult thing to get hold of for many rural peoples, right? Speaking of altars, and I live in Amsterdam, same problem. Living space is very difficult to find. Everything is really cramped, and I had to make some tough decisions, especially when my husband got initiated, and eventually we had this proliferations of altars all over the house, and we had more altars and more spirits in the house than we had space for human beings, and we had to kind of make some tough decisions and trim down our altar space. So yeah, that might be an interesting thing to chat about. What's your thoughts on altars, minimalist or otherwise?
Yeah, I'm going through the same process in my own life right now. I think when I was younger and just kind of starting down this path, I don't know if this is actually common advice or if it was just advice that I was encountering a lot personally, but I felt like every pamphlet that I read or book that I read was just advising me to get more stuff over and over again. And every spirit that I read about, the first step was always build them an altar and put their image on it. And you do end up exactly in the situation that you just described, where one day you wake up and you realize that there's not enough room for you to live in as a human. Like, you don't have the same joy of movement, of being able to cook food in your kitchen if it is full of your magical herbs and supplies, to the point, to an excessive point. Or if you can't find the herbs that you cook with because they're all mixed in with things that you use exclusively for magic. Or if you can't, for me, a part of my spiritual practice is sometimes I just need to have a little impromptu dance party. even if it's just me alone in the apartment, like I need to be able to dance around and listen to music. And if I'm tripping over tons of books and authors and, athames and chalices and this and that, like I'm not going to be able to commune with my own spirit, and that's a non-starter. So I'm definitely one for the Marie Kondo school of minimalism, which is not to um, fetishize having no stuff, but to rather be very intentional about what stuff you keep. Because every day, everything that you keep, that is an active action. It's a decision that you're making to hold on to things. And anything that you are expending that energy on keeping should be something that you want to carry forward into your future. Um, so I definitely give people permission to edit your altars, to pare down, to really listen to what is actually working for you. And to the flip side of that is to be more intentional when you do buy new things. And to really examine your motivation for buying new things. Are you purchasing something because it really moves your soul, and that using that perfume every day is going to be a beautiful experience? Or are you doing it because somebody has taught you that you need that thing in order to feel magical?
Yeah, and I would add that, dead altars, altars that are just standing there, that are not being taken care of, that are just um, collecting dust, that I refer to them as dead altars, are not spiritually healthy.
Yeah.
They can accrue a kind of grime, spiritual grime, and maybe I tend to be quite um, concerned when I hear people have a lot of that kind of thing happening around them. For me, that tends to be a symptom of or a potential cause of problems in some sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, in your book, you say something very interesting that I find I could relate to very powerfully, and it's the fact that if you want to instantiate the presence of the ancestors or the dead, that it is important, in fact, to give them something. Whether it's a glass of water and a candle, or maybe something more elaborate, it is important to do that. But as it happens, my training, it kind of worked out that I got trained by a very accomplished espiritista for a number of years. And then I proceeded to be mentored by an elderly SNU spiritualist minister. And this was quite an interesting comparison, because for the Anglo spiritualist, the idea of actually having anything material to instantiate that power is not something that they would ever consider. When I mentioned this to him, he would be kind of like, "What are you talking about? This is not necessary." And they talk more about that they'll talk about something like sitting in the power or developing the power, and it really is a practice that happens on a spiritual level. And I think for people who find it impossible to create altars, which is often the case if you're living with a spouse or a relative with parents who maybe, um, look askance at that kind of thing. It's also possible to develop a relationship with your ancestral powers by creating time and an intentionality around working with them, just setting aside time. Do you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I think, for me, part of the reason why I am so, I caution people around creating multiple altars and encourage them to be very deliberate about what altars they create. But then on the same hand, or on the other hand, I do encourage people to create an ancestor altar because it is such a powerful thing. It's very powerful, but it's not necessary, because the primary anchor that our ancestors have in this world is our bodies. This gift that they've given us, and that's the thing that they're going to be, I guess, kind of like attracted to, and that they're going to respond to the most. And so beyond that, I think creating a container for doing the work, whether it is an altar that you could go to pray and to interact with, or whether it is the container of this time that I'm going to set aside on, every Sunday, I'm going to, from the hour of, I don't know, 11 to noon, I'm going to do these particular prayers. What type of a container will work for you and the way that you're developing right now is a very personal thing. For me, the altar is important because I'm just a very sensual person, I guess, and so I need that thing that I can look at and see, and the process of editing actually, and like taking things off of it or putting things back onto it,
Mhm.
that is my prayer. And it's a lot more effective for me to do that than it is for me to sit for an hour and like meditate or say a prayer. I still do those things as well. It's just that, like, for me, it's primarily about the environment and kind of interacting with the environmental factors. And also, I think it's being able to put those practices together and see the way that they mirror themselves. How does my prayer life shift when I put my statue of St. Anthony back on the altar, or take it away again? That's very indicative of kind of the way that spirit is moving, I think, through our lives.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the prayer because that was really one of my favorite chapters in your book.
Oh,
And
thank you.
it's a tricky subject. It's a tricky subject with this audience, with our audience, because there's a lot of baggage around prayer and so on. And I think one of the great potentials for ancestral veneration is to really rehabilitate prayer as a functional practice and as something that is, maybe there can be some healing around religious wounds with it, working with your ancestors in prayer and so on. And one of the things that I also loved about that chapter is the way you talk not about, you mentioned not only praying to the ancestors, but praying for the ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And the intercession that we have to do for the spirit people, essentially. Maybe you could say a bit more about that.
Well, I think you're totally spot on with regard to the fact that prayer needs to be rehabilitated, and that not everybody is able to connect to it immediately, precisely because it cuts a little bit too close to home. But with ancestor veneration, that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for the things that maybe are either very comforting or very discomforting because of the fact that they bring us back to our early childhood, our relationships with our caregivers, what our home life was like. You need to be willing to go that deep. It's not something that you can just kind of layer on top of all of the selves that you've accrued over the course of your lifetime. And it can't be something that's just like, hip and really doing it for you in the moment. Like, it has to bring you back over and over again. And so for many of us, prayer is something that we were taught to do as children, but in a way that, maybe was not that satisfying. And that's why we ended up becoming occultists and witches and magicians instead of just going to church like a normal person. And so rehabilitating prayer is then about both establishing the magical power of our voice and the being able to pray, to sing, to speak what's on your heart, as well as kind of addressing what our early childhood experiences with the divine were, and with spirituality and religiosity and spiritual communities.
Yeah, the childhood connection is very important. In my experience, that was really where the charge around prayer sat, because it took me to my childhood self when I've had um, my first religious impulses, right? So there's a part of me that is still that little boy praying, and that child is what connects with the practice too. And that child of course, the child energy or the child's attitude is of course very useful when you're connecting with an ancestor.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot recently in terms of my really good friend Vanessa Irina, who's a musician and occultist, and we've been talking a lot about the ways in which our early childhood experiences with our primary caregivers, in both of our cases it was our biological parents, have informed our assumptions about the divine and the way that the universe works, and how children who have very strong, stable, supportive, nurturing, protective experiences with their primary caregivers as children grow into adults who are able to trust the divine and able to trust the universe to provide them. And honestly, I really believe this is the reason why in southern Italy and Sicily, God is a woman. God is a mother. The primary way that we, express who the divine is, what the universe is, what incarnation means is through the image of the Madonna, who's a loving mother. And sometimes quite scary too, but primarily loving, primarily nurturing. And yeah, I think we have the opportunity through a combination of ancestor veneration and maybe a little bit of therapy on the side to address the ways in which maybe our primary caregivers were not able to be omniscient and omnipotent and to meet every single one of our physical and emotional needs when we were growing up, but to rehabilitate that relationship with those people specifically, but also in doing so to be able to return to that place of childhood faith that things will be okay.
Yeah, you put that very beautifully. And it brings us, of course, to the next important point. How do we work with ancestors with whom we have had troubled relationships? We may have had a parent or a grandparent or some other relative who maybe there was some abuse, maybe there were other problems we had. And now we are engaging in a practice of veneration of these people. And this is a question I hear a lot from clients who come for sittings and so forth. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think there's two really important parts of it. One is remembering that you are not alone. A lot of people have the same type of trauma, the same type of questions that they're facing. As you just mentioned, I get this question a lot as well from people who find me through the blog or through my writing. You're not alone. You're not the only person going through this. It's very, very common. I think it might even be more common than everything's just okay and hunky-dory and I feel fine about all of my family. Family stuff is always hard. The second part of it is there's not a right or a wrong way to do this. And in the book, I give an example of a ritual that you can do if you read it and you like it and it sounds good to you. But ultimately, your spirit is going to lead you in the direction of healing. And whatever that is will be unique to you. And it might not work for me. It might not work for any other random person. But it's not like there's a specific recipe that you just follow and then bam, you're healed and your ancestors are all settled and everything's great. It's an ongoing process, and being able to listen to the direction that you're being led in and execute on that, to do those small things, to not let the overthinking it get in the way or the self-doubt get in the way. That's really what is going to facilitate the healing process.
Beautiful. And what I sometimes like to from my experience, is that often the spirits with whom we've had troubled relationships, the relatives with whom we've had problems, stand up for us more powerfully when they're on the other side. Their work isn't done. It's not that they had a sudden, their evolution hasn't stopped, and they see things from a different perspective on that side, and they often are, they try and make up for it. They try and heal that wound in some way. And
Right.
it often surprises clients and sitters to hear that this parent or grandparent with whom they've had some sort of troubled relationship is the one that is in fact really working for them. That's the one that's giving the most support.
That's beautiful. I've known a couple of good friends who have gone through a similar process. Yeah, I didn't realize that that was so common.
In terms of mediumship and communication with the dead, what are your thoughts on developing mediumship in isolation? Someone who is interested in not only working with their ancestors through some sort of practice of veneration, but wants to engage in communication. What would your recommendations be around that?
Well, I think mediumship is kind of it's a very large umbrella. And so under this umbrella, we have people who specifically develop the ability to produce very specific information and, very facilitating very powerful spirit contact, who are professionals. They train in this. They devote their lives to it, and are basically like the professional chefs of the medium world. But then on the other hand, all of us need to be able to cook and eat, and all of us live in this matrix of spirit. All of us are a part of the animist ecosystem, and so all of us are mediums in that sense. And while I don't think I will ever be the type of person who can sit with a total stranger and tell them what their grandmother's name and birthday was, I also don't need to be able to do that. That's not very helpful for me in my personal life. I need to be able to make good decisions about, major life choices that I'm making. And my grandmother's name and birthday is not going to help me very much in doing that. So what I really encourage people to do is to reframe the way that they think about mediumship and the assumptions that they have about what a medium should or should not be able to do and what it's good for, and also what the risks are. And I talk about this in the book, that our culture does tend to have a very negative view of spirits by default, and of spirit contact. And so, most of us will have grown up with more ghost stories that are about, poltergeists throwing things around the kitchen at 3 a.m. than we've grown up with stories about, a grandparent showing up and telling you not to get on the plane and saving your life. So yeah, expanding the notion of what mediumship can be, what form it can take, and what will happen if we start to develop is really important to do before you start to develop. But then when you decide to go down that path and to start exercising these muscles, and they are muscles at the end of the day, we have to use them in order to strengthen them. A lot of it looks sort of like the types of exercises that you might have done in art class. So learning how to notice things, to look at things a different way, to observe the finer details, not just visually, but using all of our senses. That's really the starting point, I think. And for most of us, we will naturally gravitate towards a particular sense and a particular type of conditions that facilitate this. For me, low light conditions, a little bit of candlelight, and some music, and that's really all I need. I don't need to do drumming for 10 hours in order to facilitate spirit contact, although that can be fun as well. For you, it might be very different. For anybody listening to this, candlelight might not do it for them. Maybe they smell things, or maybe they are able to see things, but only in their dreams, and then they dream true. things that are about to happen in the future. But yeah, if you start by just expanding your assumption or exploding your assumptions about what mediumship should be, and then exploring all of your senses, at some point you're going to hit on something that is different from the way that you've experienced the world before. And that's the signal that you want to explore that sense more deeply, or explore practices that rely on that sense. Maybe some of the scrying exercises that you described earlier, if you're very clairvoyant. Yeah, I'm sorry, that was a bit rambly, but I hope that's helpful.
No, it was great, really great. And how would you figure divination into this? Because in your book you talk a lot about divination in several of the chapters, and I found that really helpful. Uh,
Yeah.
and invoking the ancestral forces, the ancestors in that work.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, I know that I'm on the right track when every all of my spiritual practices are sort of pointing in the right direction. And they might not be saying the exact same thing, but they are guiding me in the same direction. And so that can mean combining mediumship practices with your understanding of astrology and the transits that you're going through. Or one thing that I like to do is to use cartomancy as a way to validate mediumship, because otherwise it might be kind of hard for me to discern, how do I translate this squishy feeling into an action. um, and cartomancy to me is very important. I read with just the regular playing cards that are available to me at any drugstore or bodega for $2. And I find that it works best when I already have kind of an indication of where I want to go or what I want to do, based on the mediumship that I'm doing, based on the spiritual practice that I have every day. And at that stage, I am completely open to whatever the answer is. But I need that answer through the cards in order to remain unblocked, and in order to be able to move forward, if that makes sense.
It does. And what I love about that is the use of the tool to confirm what might be an impulse, a mediumistic impression you're receiving. Of course, when the medium is doing sitting with the sitter, there is someone there who can confirm or deny the information that they're receiving. And
Mm-hmm.
that is actually an iterative process that is part of mediumship. So you might say, well, I've got a granny here, she passed of cancer, and so on. And that person will be able to say, yes, I do have a grandmother that passed of cancer, or no.
Mm-hmm.
And details like that can be verified essentially. But when you're by yourself, how do you get that verification of an impulse?
Yeah.
So I love your use of a tool to do that. That is a very helpful, certainly been a helpful device for me. So are there any, in terms of the ancestral, in terms of taking care of your ancestors, honoring your ancestors, working with the ancestors, is there anything that you would caution viewers, things that they might avoid, things to be wary of, certain zones to be a little bit more careful in?
Hmm. I think one thing that I've been observing a lot of, that I want to bring to people's attention, is over identifying with your ancestors.
Hmm.
And so I see, because now I see more and more people who are starting to delve into this work, and they're bringing that passion with them, of a new project, a new beginning. And I love that. I love that passion. But I think the risk that comes with it is starting to think in terms of, like, oh, well, my ancestors did this and they did that and they were so great, and like everything that they did was so wonderful. So I don't have to try, because I already have these magic ancestors and I can kind of just rest on their laurels. Or the flip side of it can be, well, I know my ancestors were assholes. I know that they were responsible for all of this, oppression, and that they have established this system which hurts people. And I feel so, so bad about that, that I'm not ever going to think about them. And I'm just not going to bother trying, because what can I do? They've already created this system and it's so big compared to me. I'm so small. So you can't over identify with your ancestors. You have to give space for the fact that you are the one who's alive today, and you are different from them. They are reflected in their parts of their stories are reflected in your story. And you do have the benefit of the lessons that they learned throughout their lifetimes. But ultimately, you're here to learn different lessons. And you can't rest on their laurels, and you cannot allow either the good things that they did to paralyze you by making you feel like you could never live up to that, or the bad things that they did to paralyze you because you feel responsible for the things that they did.
Yes. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, definitely. So, I mean, that of course brings me to the question that I'm sure a lot of viewers on my channel would be interested in finding out more, is the magical aspect of working with the ancestors. Sometimes I warn people to not instrumentalize them too soon, not to use them for for money and sex and these kinds of things. But what are some ways in which we can work with this support system that we have in a practical way, magically?
Well, I actually, before pivoting to that, I want to emphasize the point that you just made about not turning it into a magical practice too quickly. And the reason why I think that that's so important is, even once you do get to the point where you're incorporating your ancestors into your magical practice, I would hazard a guess that like 80% of the benefit that they are going to provide to that practice is going to be in the form of the guidance, helping you make better decisions, helping you to grow spiritually, because our magical tools are just tools. And ultimately, we are the artist. We're the artist who is creating our life. And you can give someone who hasn't developed that talent yet a very good tool. Returning to our music metaphor before, you can buy the fanciest guitar, but if you give it to somebody who doesn't know how to play their scales, it's not going to be good music. And so really, we need that foundation. And even once you get to the point where you're doing maybe more daring magical work, the foundation is what is going to be lifting up that work, if that makes sense.
Yes.
All of the stuff that you've been doing in terms of your prayer practice, if you tend to an altar and keep that altar alive, the cleansings that you do, the advice that you're getting through mediumship and through divination, that is the lion's share of the work. The magic itself can be as simple as lighting a candle at the right time, or having the clarity of what it is you really need to manifest, and then just going down to the river and praying for it. Like, it's less about the techniques, which are also fun and cool, and can add a certain zest to life, but more about the fact that, returning to an idea from earlier, that ritual, that spell, that magic that you do is inextricable from what happened to you when you were driving out to the woods in order to do that ritual, or the divination that you did before and after it, or the friendship that you have with the person you're doing the ritual with. All of these things are constantly flowing into one another and informing one another.
Yeah, and I love what you say about it being a supporting framework, a supporting foundation, really. In my own experience, aside from somehow explicitly working with the dead as magical agents in some sort of explicit spell work, as a Solomonic magician or as a magician in general, I found that that the most important role that the ancestors have for me is as a kind of insulation, as a stabilizing force for my life, and as a kind of shock absorbing uh, principle, because
Yes.
magicians are often invoking forces that are either very powerful, or they could be potentially be corrosive, or they could be there might be unexpected results. And I find that the ancestors have a stabilizing quality that helps maintain that stability in your life as a whole, and so that you can have a healthy life in addition to your magical practice, so that your magical work doesn't tear through your life in a potentially destructive way if you're working with other kinds of hotter spirits, or maybe planetary forces that are more severe in some way. Have you experienced that?
Yes, and I think that that is beautifully well put, and very very important for people to internalize if you're going to be doing strong work, and I would say work that calls on any other type of spirit or intelligence, other than what I refer to as spirits in proximity. So your own spirit, your ancestors, and the spirits of place, the spirits that you're going to be bumping into anyway, just as a result of being an incarnate being. Um, if you're doing work with any spirits beyond the spirits in proximity, like, you need to make sure that those relationships are very, very firm, because they're going to provide you that foundation. And they may also just prevent you from doing something really, really dumb.
Yes.
There are certain types of magical work that are like cooking, sort of like mediumship we were talking about earlier, where it's like, look, everybody has to be able to do it. Everybody needs to be able to feed themselves. And it's pretty forgiving and very personalized to like your taste. And other than the fact that you need to know not to put your hand on the stove itself, don't burn yourself. There's not going to be a lot that can go terribly, terribly wrong. Um, but then there are things that are more like baking, where you need to be more precise with the use of the ingredients, the amount of the ingredients. Otherwise, the correct chemical interactions are not going to happen. And instead of a cake, you're going to end up with hot soup.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are certain magical operations which are more like metallurgy, where if you get something wrong, you can blow yourself up. And literally.
Yeah.
So it's important to, I think it's important to know why you're motivated to do any magical work whatsoever, and whether it is something that your soul needs to experience in order to continue evolving, or whether it's something that you think it just looks cool, or you're trying to fill some kind of hole that exists in you with stuff that sounds fancy and dangerous. So it's important to know your motivations, but then it's also important to know, is this cooking, is this baking, or is this metallurgy? And if it's metallurgy, you should probably be training with somebody who has been doing it for a very long time and not blown themselves up yet.
Indeed. I love that analogy, cooking, baking, or metallurgy. One of the things that, it's not a technique, but one of the ideas that I've taken over from the Ocha side of my practice into my Solomonic practice, is before engaging in any ritual that is something new or risky, or I'm contacting an intelligence or a being that is something new to my experience level, I will always ask before I start the rite. I'll speak to my ancestors first and do some divination and say, is it okay for me to proceed with this?
Yeah.
And often enough, they say yes. and then I know I will at least not be blown up.
Yeah.
And then at other times they've been no. There's just been a clear no when I thought I was fully prepared and ready to go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And this has saved me a lot of personal difficulties that would have otherwise ended up in some burnt fingers. And I have burnt my fingers. So is that something that you've experimented with yourself, insofar as the connection between ancestral communication, or working with them as a guiding principle in your magical practice that might be unrelated to that?
Yeah, I have definitely, and you know, the idea of honoring your ancestors first. I've also been taught that in Ocha, and at the same time, it makes perfect sense to me naturally, and it's something that I think I probably would have come to even if I hadn't had a teacher explaining it to me. And so I think it is a really good practice for people to you know, to start developing for themselves, whatever that means for themselves. Maybe it's checking in with divination and making a couple of offerings before embarking on any ritual. But in the interest of transparency, I will also say that as I have developed my my relationship with the spirits in proximity I was describing earlier, my own spirit, my ancestors and spirits of place, I found myself doing less and less magical work. And I think a lot of people will find that some people are really cut out for magical work, and that's an important part of the evolution that they're going through in this lifetime. For others, though, it may be something else. And for me, I think really I get a lot more out of the sensuality and the mysticism and having, you know, facilitating those types of experiences than I do out of you know, studying Solomonic magic, for example, which is something that I was very interested in several years ago, but has now kind of naturally fallen to the wayside for me. And that isn't to say that like one is better than the other. It's more about you know, if you're drawn to something, you're drawn to it for a reason, but that doesn't mean you're going to be doing it for the rest of your life. And I think when we develop our relationship with the strong helping spirits who are, you know, maybe in our ancestral court or our spiritual court more broadly, they can help us do that discernment and bring us to the practices that are going to be the most beneficial for us in this lifetime.
That's so beautifully put, really beautifully put. And I love what you say about the need to do magic really becoming, you know, vanishingly small once your spiritual framework is stable and you have that ancestral support. Because maybe, I mean, even though there might be some interest in it as a practice, yeah, you tend to find that that you don't need to use practical magic to really to do much anymore.
Yeah, and you know, I think we've all maybe gone through this if you know you're exploring magic, where maybe you're doing spell after spell after spell for the same result and it's not working out, and it's like, okay, well, what is that about? And I think in some magical communities there's a need to save face and to look more, you know, to look powerful, to look cool, whatever it can be, that keeps us from really being honest with each other about what we're really doing magic for and what types of results we're really seeing. And maybe this is the other side of it. You know, when you have a deeply rooted ancestral practice, you don't need to look cool anymore. You don't have to worry about it. And you can focus on like telling the truth and seeking out heart-to-heart connection with other people. And that's, you know, that's one of the real joys of being incarnate.
Beautiful. Well, that's a brilliant note to end on, I think. This has been a lovely discussion, Mallory, and it's been a great pleasure talking to you about this topic. And
So much for having me.
maybe we could do it again sometime.
Yeah, I would love that.
And is there, I mean, where can people find you? Do you have some website links you'd like to share? I could always add these to the oobly doob.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is roadsideomens.com, and you can find all the information about all of my projects there. You can also follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Honoring Your Ancestors. And if you're interested in Italian spirit work specifically, I have a website called Italian Folk Magic, which is also on Facebook and Instagram under the same name. And so, yeah, I look forward to, if anybody has been inspired by this conversation, feel free to reach out on one of those platforms. And I've been sharing a lot recently, especially on the Honoring Your Ancestors Instagram, diving into some of these same topics that we've been discussing during this interview. So if you want to hear more, definitely follow me there.
Brilliant. Well, I certainly will be doing that. Well, thanks, Mallory.
Thanks so much, Balthazar.